Welcome back to the extraordinary little village of Pietrapertosa in the little Italian southern Dolomites. It was the right decision to jump on a plane and head right back here. As you can see, the weather is just off the hook. Everything is crazy. There's a parade, there's music, there's all this stuff that... Wait, are we out of B-roll already? That's all I shot while I was there? Oh well. I'm actually on Patrick's porch, but I want to talk to you guys about something really important. Well, I didn't actually just leave the studio and go back to Pietrapertosa just from here. I actually had an opportunity to return because I had a couple projects in Europe. And I was never really happy with this part of photographing the world. Spending 4 days there, really loving the town, wanting to get the best shot, I knew that I was going to need to go back at some point. Now, throughout the duration of photographing the world, we've shot some very known locations and some very unknown locations. So it's important to get those very known locations right. Obviously, you want an epic shot that you can share, that you can use in your portfolio. But with Pietrapertosa and some of the areas around the south of Italy, they are relatively undiscovered. So I knew when I researched this a couple years ago that it was going to be perfect for photographing the world, but also perfect for my portfolio. I wanted to have a great representation of what I thought the potential of beauty in this little town could be. And that's really a good lesson in itself. If something's important to you, if you find the shot that means a lot to you and you really want to add it to your portfolio, it may not be the first try. It may not be the first day, the fourth day, the second visit, third visit, or even the first year. You may actually go back year after year. And a lot of the big shots in my portfolio, my most famous shots that I have been that. They've been multiple visits spread across years of time where I've waited for those perfect conditions in order to be able to capture the shot. So this was a good example too, and I wanted to have a really good shot to share where we could really take advantage of the sunset. And we got really lucky when we were there. It wasn't that out of the way from Spain. We were able to fly there, drive. It's a very cheap part of Italy to be in. And we spent 4 more days and had the perfect conditions. The other thing that's really cool is when you spend more time in an environment, even if the weather washes out, it's rainy, misty, dreary, you still get an idea of what the shots are that you want. So when we got there again, Naomi and I really only had to spend a couple days. I knew exactly where to be, exactly where I wanted to set up, and exactly the shot I wanted to capture. Luckily enough, everything was great. Every day was a beautiful sunset, and I was able to get the shot that I really wanted on the second try. So now that the illusion of being back in Italy has been broken by the awesomeness of Patrick's front porch, I'm going to go ahead and head back into the studio, and we're going to post-process those new files that I was able to capture. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody, but, truthfully, I never actually left. Here's the result of what I shot in Pietrapertosa just about a month ago before I headed to the studio at all. Now, I originally scheduled about 5 days in the town, but every day the sunset was so amazing that we actually only spent about 3 days because we captured everything that we want. So without taking up any more time explaining Pietrapertosa, let's go ahead and dive right into Lightroom and take a look at these shots. First of all, take a look at this sunset. Now, this is an underexposed image. You can see there are still some areas that are blown out in the sky, but it was incredible. The town itself looked pretty similar, but since this was the summertime, you can see that I actually have green trees. So when we were in the field together in the last lesson, I kind of discussed the fact that seasonal variations can occur. Now, I'm not sure what type of trees these are. I did not make notes, but there were no flowers. I thought there could be flowers in the springtime. But in the fall, this could turn into golden shades. Now, as far as the town itself, there were a few things that changed. It was actually right in the middle of the season. There was a festival, but the town itself still felt so empty. It was amazing. So I went ahead and I went through this, and it was summertime, so it was a very long, we were actually here during the solstice, I believe. So the sunset was really late. It lasted way into the blue hour, and you can see that into the blue hour, we have even more light in the city than before because there's a lot of people home. The other thing is up here on the castle. Now, I never really mentioned that this is a castle, but it's an old cathedral up there. You can actually hike up the mountain. There's stone steps. You can see because there was a festival, and this is actually in season, not dead of winter. This is actually lighting up green. So everything here just looks so much better. So this is what I really envisioned for the shot. I wanted to be able to first start with a blend here of the perfect sunset, and then bring in the perfect blue hour. So I've went ahead and isolated and called all the other files so we can hone in just on the ones that we want to look at. Now before we get started though, let's go ahead and change those settings that we always like to change here. Now first thing is scrolling down, let's go ahead and change that noise reduction back up to 20. The other thing I want to point out here is I was a little bit better with the camera setup, not a little bit better I should say, a little bit different with the camera setup. This time since the sky was going off, I almost had the horizon level, but it was the same situation where I was shooting right in that guy's sort of parking lot area right next to his door. And as I was shooting this, like, he actually came out the door. We never saw him in the wintertime, and he kind of looked at me, looked at the cameras, and like smiled and gave me a thumbs up. So I was like, cool. But I still just wanted to set it, and I had it shooting every minute and a half. But I got very close. But you can see these lines are just off just a hair, very, very close. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is just manually, once again, just change that. We're going to use the same settings, same areas that we used before, just by zooming in, panning over, and finding these nice areas of contrast. So right here to here looks pretty good. Actually, let's use this one this time. Here to here. Perfect. Let's go ahead and move it a little bit so it's just right. Scroll back over. I'm going to use the same building that I used before. If it's not broke, don't fix it. It worked last time. Let's go ahead and get this done really quickly so we can jump right into the files themselves. Looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and remove that option. Zoom it out. That looks pretty close. Actually, I think I may need to just make a little bit of a tweak here. Yeah, that looks good. So we'll check it out. So that looks pretty good. So that is set. Everything else was set. Let's go ahead and do the same thing that we did before. Command click all these, right click, develop settings, and sync settings. During this, the sunset was going off. It took a massive amount of underexposing to be able to get the sky and quite a bit of overexposing actually to get the town itself. You can see this is exposed almost perfectly. This one's right in the middle. But there's no way I can't get those highlights back. This is really frustrating because this is one of those situations where I can't quite get everything with a single RAW. I'm going to have to do it with a combination of a few. So rather than just going from here, one extreme to the other, I'm going to show you guys a technique for blending multiple exposures together so that you have less of a discrepancy between those layers. So if you think about it as having, if you want to get from here to here, the best thing to do is to have a transition of somewhere halfway in between to blend to. So let's take a look at all three. This is going to be our base exposure. In other words, we're going to start with the town correctly exposed, then we're going to bring this one in, and then we're going to bring this one in. Now, all I want to do is identify right here. I believe that I need to tweak the highlights just a little bit, just to bring those down. Not too much. Maybe it's actually the whites. It looks like it's those super highlights. And what I'm doing is looking just around here. So I'm just going to tweak that just a hair. Just like that. I'm going to select all three of these, export with previous. Alright, now that I'm in Photoshop, I have all three of these, so it's a little bit easier to just load files into Stack, add the open files, and say OK. Perfect. I can close these down for resources, and in the background I can just go ahead and save this in my temp directory here. Perfect. So I should have, this is the base here, this is the middle ground. Yeah, perfect. So we have the base, we have the middle ground, and we have the highlights. So let's see what we want to do. Let's go ahead and look at our base exposure, and let's use some luminosity masking, some simple luminosity masking to bring these three together. So I'm going to go to Channels, load RGB as a selection by command clicking it, and I'm going to create a new mask called Alpha 1. We'll call this Highlights 1. By now, this should be second nature to you guys. We'll go ahead and load this and create a folder above this one here. We'll start one at a time, and we'll call this Middle Exposure. We'll call this Base Exposure. And I'll do in parentheses here that we are exposing shadows here. So we have the middle exposure. We'll go ahead and load that up. Now right off the bat, that's looking pretty good. That's pretty much what we want there. So let's go ahead and do this one more time. Let's go ahead and load this. We'll go to this layer here, turn it on, and I'll go ahead and create the same folder, and we'll call this highlight exposure. Well, let's take a look at what we have. Well, you know, it's something. So we've gone from here to here to here. And what we have is a very flat looking image. So let's see what we can do about that. Let's go ahead and take the middle exposure here, and we'll call this same thing, middle exposure, and let's go ahead and black the whole thing out. Now, we're really only concerned about the sky, so we can very easily just go ahead and paint a gradient mask from about here to here. We know we need that in the sky. That's our transition. If I turn this on and off, you can see we can go ahead and paint out just a little bit with a low flow. We can go ahead and start to remove some of this, some of the town around here, because we don't need that. And if I show my mask here, you can see it's pretty easy to remove. So we're just going to go ahead and remove a little bit more, just like that. Because with that luminosity that we're bringing in, if we bring in too much, it actually dulls things out. So let's just go ahead and cut around these corners here. Whoops, I'm actually painting with the wrong one. I don't know if you guys noticed that. I was painting with white. I need to black that out instead. Perfect. Good start. Next thing, let's do the same thing here. Let's go ahead and say we want to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and create a layer that's blacked out, and I'm going to create a gradient here. So let's just say from white to black right around there. And that looks pretty good, but a few things are happening that I don't like. One, I'm not happy about this mountain, and I feel like the right side of the sky looks pretty good. It's just that left side that I'm concerned about. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's delete this mask, and I'm going to delete it. And I'm going to name this highlights. And I'm going to create another folder, and I'm just going to put that inside of the folder. So the first thing I want to do is address what we did before. I know that I want to have the highlights start around here and fade out around here. Now the reason is I don't want the entire sky. I actually have to figure out a good balance for this. And with this mask, I can actually just go ahead and transform it a little bit, just like this, until I figure out the right balance of those highlights that I want to bring in. That looks pretty good like that. I'll hit return. I'll link that mask up. So the next thing, and what you've noticed, this is just going to be nested. I'm just going to call it nested highlights. What I've done is I've created a folder here and then another nested folder, which leaves this layer now free for an additional mask. I'm going to go ahead and create a mask on this folder. Now what I'm going to do is have these highlights exist only from about here to here. You see that? Works pretty good. So I'm able to sort of resolve that darker part of the sky and bring it back, which looks pretty good. And I can keep doing this until I get it just right. That looks pretty good. And again, same thing. I can scale this a little bit just to get it perfect, exactly where I want it. From there, let's go ahead and link it. And now, let's go ahead and toggle this on and off again. And you can see we are starting to mainly dull down the city a little bit right here. So now this mask controls just about everything. This one actually just removes the right side of the sky. So let's go ahead and go to this mask, hit brush, and let's paint out selectively together, almost like we did before with the other layer. This time I'm going to be really careful to not go into the sky. If I go into the sky, that's going to happen. So I have to be really careful here to brush this in. Now feel free to use the selection tool if that's easier. I think that this is a little bit more subtle if we use the brush, and a little bit easier to deal with. Again, even though I have knocked out part of the mountain over here, I still want to bring back all of that crisp contrast that we had before. Let's back it up a little bit, check the mask. It looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and fade a little bit more off, and I'll make sure that I didn't get the sky. Perfect, looks good. This is already starting to look so much better than the other shot. Let's go back to Lightroom. And now that we have those addressed, let's talk a little bit about this blue hour shot. We're just going to be using the lights, so I might want to pull the shadows up just a little bit. Actually, a little bit went a long way. Let's keep it right around 40. So between 35 and 40, and let's export this as well with previous. Select all, copy, close, select the top portion of this and paste. So we're going to call this mid-blue hour. With the mid-blue hour selected, let's see what it looks like when we toggle lighten on and off. All right, well, the town, it looks pretty awesome so far. It's going to need some work, but it looks really good. It's going to need a little bit of work around here. We're going to address these blurry trees and everything, but right off the bat, you can see we don't want that affecting the sky. It's going to be a little tricky to pull the same kind of selection we did last time because this part of the mountain is really lit up. Instead, we're going to do this an easy way. I'm going to create a new mask, and I'm actually just going to manually, flow at 100%, paint this out. So we know we don't need the lights on the mountains. We know we need that light on the mountain, just like that. And I want to get rid of all this. Pretty easy. As I start to get close to this area, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit and give a little bit more care to this. So we're going to make it a little bit of a smaller brush here, and I'm just going to start painting all of this out. So I want to keep the lights there. I want to keep everything, all the integrity of those lights over there, but remove this completely from the sky. Here as well. Now, we could use the selection tool here, but I have a feeling that I can quickly and easily paint this out instead. So if I just go ahead and I'm going to get really close around that object, just like this, and zero in on it, all around it. And I'm close. Now the easiest thing to do would just be mask this whole thing out. But this is photographing the world. We don't take the easy way out, do we? We like to do everything so it looks good. It's the point of creating portfolio work in general. So let's go ahead and make this even smaller here. I'm going to take this down to about 20% flow, and I'm just going to kind of brush this in and blend it into its surroundings so that there's no halo. Perfect. Same thing here. There's no real light in there. We need to see through it. It's perfect, just like that. Now the nice thing is the lighting isn't perfect, so anything sort of, you know, if you accidentally paint a little of this or paint a little bit of that, it's not going to matter in the long run because it essentially just exists there because we say it does. One last thing before I commit to this is just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And it looks like I didn't miss anything. No corners of the sky, no parts of the sky here. Maybe, you know what, just a hair maybe right here. If I go back in just to make sure, whoops, wrong one. Just to make sure that I get all of that removed. Now, the cleanup phase. Let's take a look here. There's one thing that I noticed as soon as I applied that layer, and that's some ghosting on the cars. So these cars are there, and I guess then they're not. So this actually looks really funny and not good at all. So there are a couple things that we can do. Now, usually with this kind of thing, if we were blending different stages of blue hour, we could knock this out. But if we knock that out, we lose the lighting. I don't know about you, I don't want to lose the lighting. So this is the mid-blue hour. What I'm going to do is duplicate this layer, and we're going to make some naming changes. This is going to be mid-blue hour lighten. This is going to be mid-blue hour normal. The reason I'm doing that is I'm going to change this mode to normal. And you can see as I change that mode to normal, it gets rid of those funny little things. But I don't need it everywhere because it gets rid of that as well. If I really take a look at that normal layer, it's getting rid of all those colors on the roofs. That's not what I want. I just want it in specific areas that annoy me. So let's black out that mask, let's zoom in, and let's see if we can first figure out all these weird random ghosting things. So we'll go ahead and brush this in just like this, right around here, right around those cars, and we can get rid of some of that weird ghosting. And we can pan around the town, and this is that same thing that we usually do with the blue hour. You know, how much of this do we want to bring in? How much of this do we want to destroy? We can also figure out, you know, if that light was too intense, for example, here on the lighten, I can go back in like this with a little bit of painting, and I can actually remove that. So see how that was overexposed at first? Rather than creating a two-stage blue hour and blending that in, I can just go ahead and custom control the lighting on the homes themselves. So it's pretty cool, actually. Gives us the ability to custom paint. Like that highlight there, we could actually get rid of that light for the most part and use the base one that was underneath it. Just like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean these up. Bring in the lighting that I want really easily. And again, if you turn this on and off, you can see if there's anything in there, anything that is causing a red flag that needs to be changed. And we can check over here too, here and here. Like for me, for example, this does not need to be there. I feel like that is a very distracting light. This light here, quite distracting. This gives you the power to go ahead and change those things. And you want to do them early before you start layering more things in. This light here, too much. This light here, too intense. We'll pull it down just a little bit. What about this light here? What about this light trail? Well, let's get rid of that. Normally I like light trails in cars, but in this case I feel like it's very distracting to the town itself. All right, well, what about something else? Let's take a look at this. What about blurry trees? It was really windy, and you see how those trees are blurry, and the reason they're getting more blurry is because I'm adding that blending mode on top. Well, I probably want to remove it in certain areas. So let's see what we can do. Let's go ahead and remove around these trees where we're getting that blue. That looks pretty bad. So we definitely want to remove it around the edges. Everything else looks pretty good. These, I don't really like that. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. We have to be really careful around the areas that are lit, because the areas that are lit, we're going to lose lighting as well. I just want to make sure I get rid of the blurry areas. Those are looking pretty good. So let's go ahead. Now we can do a couple things here. We can either try to get rid of all of it, or we can just get rid of some of it. So this is blurry on both frames, but what I can do is just go ahead and mask out at least the center of the tree. So even if the edges are still going to be a little blurry, at least the meat of the tree here in the center, all those bushes are not going to be as blurry. So it's going to minimize the effect a little bit. But I don't want to remove all of the color and light over there. I still want the color and light. I just want to kind of clean up around it, just like this. Not a fan of blurry trees. Let's call this blended. Select them all, drag to a folder, and we'll call this blended result. Perfect. Let's go ahead and create a new layer. Shift Option Command E. Name that ACRF. And go into the Adobe Camera Raw filter. What I'm going to do is a global contrast pass. So I'm just going to add 15% contrast here. I'm going to bring the shadows up a little bit, about 15 here, and I'm a little worried about the blacks. I'm just going to add just a little bit more from the blacks here, just a hair, just like that. I'm also going to go over here to the dehaze under effects, and let's go ahead and change that a little bit, some global dehaze. So that's going to be a contrast layer. After I add the dehaze, I might want to go back and just make sure that I'm not clamping too much here in the shadows. And to compensate for those shadows, let's just go ahead and take care of that really quick with a small gradient. I'll reset that, and I'll pull the blacks up just a hair, just like that. That looks good, and I'll apply the result. So I'm going to change the name to this to be Global, so you can see our Adobe Camera Raw filter Global. Let's double down on this. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this layer, go back up to Filter and Camera Raw filter. Now what I want to do is adjust the color and intensity of that sunset, because I feel it needs to be intensified just a little bit. I'm going to leave everything else alone, and I'm just going to go ahead and draw a gradient down into the town, and we're going to tweak this in a minute once we get the exact balance of effects we want. Let's go ahead and reset it. I'm pretty sure it's close. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to adjust the color itself, and I want to cool it down a little bit. And I also want to change the tint. So if I cool the temperature down, you can see that I'm starting to get some purples. And if I shift into magenta, you can see I'm also starting to get some different color results. You can see that that looks pretty nice. The more I go, the more that purple I'm going to lose, so I have to find a balance here, somewhere between here and here. I think 10's probably going to give me exactly what I want. And now I have to decide, okay, where do I want this to end Do I want it to end and start? Do I want more of this sky down here to be purple, or do I want that to be warmer on the bottom? See how that works? And cooler on the top. So in this case, warmer on the bottom and cooler on the top. I like that. Next thing, let's go ahead and dehaze this quite a bit. I want to get some more contrast here in that sky, so I want it to be nice and dramatic, really nice and dramatic. The other thing is I want to darken it up a little bit, and I'm just going to make some adjustments here as I do that. And the next thing I need to do is compensate a little bit, so let's pull the shadows up a little bit to compensate. I'm going to have to go up quite a bit for that mountain, mostly that mountain, and also a little bit on the black. That looks pretty good. Let's go a little bit more intense with the dehaze. I'm liking that effect, and I actually want to pull it down just a little bit more. Right around there. Now, before I do anything else, I'm going to actually apply this. So let's say OK. So this doesn't look bad, but you can see that on the top of the mountain here, we're starting to change some of the tonality there. I don't really want to change the tonality there, so I want to find a way to isolate that. So let's go back to the channels here, and my original highlights 1, you can see that looks pretty good. So I'm actually going to select it. There's a lot of contrast there. I'm going to go to layers, I'm going to create another folder here, and apply it, and we're just going to be calling this highlights for color correction. And I'm going to put this ACRF, which is now becomes sky drama, inside of this folder. So now it's going to zap out part of the mountain. But the thing is, it's also going to zap out part of the sky itself. So what I'm going to do is go into this by option clicking, and I'm going to bring up the curves with Command M on the keyboard, and I'm just going to go ahead and clamp this a little bit. More intensity so it's not going to knock out the sky, and I'll go ahead and clamp down the mountain itself. So we're really only going to get that intensity on the sky. The other thing I'm going to do is go ahead and paint, just brush in a little bit here using normal and a low flow, just the top of this, right around the mountain. So we can get that nice intensity on the top of the sky. And that looks pretty good. Now I should get intensity just on the sky itself. Next thing I want to do, let's go back into that. Let's adjust this. Let's take a look here. So obviously we have this pink light, incredible sunset, blue light. Obviously that's going to refract some of that light into the town. But I feel that it's a little bit too magenta down here. While I love this magenta, I want to neutralize some of this, and while doing so, I want to go ahead and clean up these greens a little bit and also clean up the town. So instead of using hue saturation right now, let's go ahead and duplicate this and do it once again in Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm going to go ahead, go up here again, Camera Raw filter. So let's go ahead and change the temperature of the whole scene. I'm going to cool it off. And let's also change the tint. This time, instead of magenta, if we go into the green, you can see if I do it dramatically, it's going to be too much. But you can see if I go to about 25%, how that's actually going to clean up that magenta. It will make this a little bit more yellow, but we can take care of that in another sweep. The other thing I probably want to do is pull the shadows up just a little bit to compensate. And now what I'm going to do is adjust the yellow itself. So let's go here. We haven't used this tool yet, but this is the HSL or grayscale. So obviously I don't want to convert to grayscale. But what I actually have control of here is the hue, saturation, and luminance of each channel. So this works very similar to the hue and saturation sliders, but it gives me all of the sliders here, and I can't really clamp my own control over it, but I can pick the one closely that most closely resembles the area that I want to influence. And in this case, it's the yellows themselves. So let's start with the hue. If I hue shift the yellows, you can see I can warm them up. In other words, going into more of a red color, or I can make them more intensely neon yellow and green. So I would not advise doing that, but let's go ahead and pull them down into more of a suitable color temperature for this, somewhere around there. Now, the saturation, we can do the same thing. We can tweak them out, or we can make them a little bit more subtle. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to pull the saturation down just a tiny little bit, like that. Last thing we have is the luminance. You can see here is the luminance here in the yellow will actually just make them a little bit brighter or darker. And in this case, I'm just going to bring them up just a little tiny bit. So that's just going to change the yellows in that scene. And you can see in the beginning here what we're doing just by changing the tint and the temperature, we're actually mitigating some of the negativity of that color cast here. So let's just keep those settings uniform. And we'll take this down to an even 20, shave that one off, and apply it. This is going to be really easy with the ACRF. Global Copy will call this clean color foreground. Now let's go ahead and create a gradient and a mask for it. So we'll go ahead and take it from here to about here. Perfect. Now, take a look at this before and after. You can see we've cleaned up that color. Now it's time to go in and custom paint just a little bit of this here. And I'll use a very low flow, and I'll go in and say, you know what, that feels a little bit too magenta to me. This feels a little too magenta. I'm going to clean this up. Obviously, I want more green here, where this mountain is green. And in this area, maybe a little bit on the mountain, just a hair, just to bring it all in. Bring it all together. That looks good. Let's take a look at the result here. It's exactly what I want, just to mitigate it a little bit. In fact, I'm going to take the opacity down just a hair. I feel like I took it a little bit too far. It's just a copy of itself, so we'll take it down to 80%. The next thing I want to do is address some more issues. Now, when that sky's going off, you can definitely see that it's also going off in the buildings here. We have a few things going on. We have the magenta from the sky, and we also have some of the blue from the sky that we need to mitigate. So let's go ahead and load a hue saturation layer. Let's take a look at both and see if we can get them in one swipe. So we'll go to reds or yellows first. In this case, let's go ahead and kind of grab the magenta too, so red and magenta, and let's see what happens as we start to shift this. That's looking pretty good. So that's brightening it up. Let's see what happens if we darken it. Pretty similar. I actually like it to be a little bit more bright, and I'm going to pull the saturation down on it just a hair, just a tiny little bit. Now, it doesn't look good globally, but let's go ahead and go into the blues as well. Now, there aren't as many blues here to mitigate, but there's a good example. So let's go ahead and add a little bit more cyan, just a little bit of here. Same thing, let's lighten that up. Nice. Pretty easy to get rid of. Pretty easy. So we'll go ahead and zero this mask out by inverting it. And I'm going to call this blue, capitalize that, blue/magenta reduction. This is where it can get a little tricky. This is what I recommend. If we paint this, for example, and I go too far and I get the roof, you can see that I'm painting the roof. So we either have to be really careful while painting here, or we can go in and use the lasso tool for the lasso selections. That's totally up to you. In fact, for something like this, it may actually be quicker and easier to just go in and start drawing these out, just like this. So we want to draw this out, and as we do that, depending on our foreground and background color, I can actually just flood this with color. So flood it, and then I can go in and brush a little of the result in a little bit between. So for these buildings, this one's probably pretty easy to just go ahead and paint out. Here it's easy to paint out, there's nothing really surrounding it. But some of them are going to be a little bit more difficult, like this one here. Let's say I just want to go ahead and isolate this building. What I'll do is just quickly, with the lasso tool, drag it, mitigate. Same thing here. Drag it in, paint it out. Very, very easy. Same thing here. This is where it gets very interesting. So there's not a lot of color separation here on the side of the homes, but if I were to, for example, chisel this out a little bit, clicking here, it's a very easy mask to make. You can see that it's actually going to start chiseling out that detail as well, just a little bit, but it adds quite a bit. So I could actually go in here and start to make separate selections, just little tiny selections of these areas that I want to clean up. And using selections, that means I'm not going to border any of the roof, and I can easily make adjustments. Like this building here is very, very magenta, but if I wanted it to pop out a little bit more on this side, I could easily do that. So this is causing more dimensionality to the scene. It's giving more separation of depth here, rather than everything being uniform here. That creamy red color, now we can start to go ahead and separate some of these areas apart. And again, you can switch between using that sort of hard edge method or a soft edge method here with the brush if you're very careful. Color is pretty easy, it's very, very forgiving, but if you want to do angles are really kind of tricky. You want to make sure you can just go in and do this. Very, very easy, and you can even just shift select and adding these. Sometimes this is actually quicker than using the paintbrush because you don't have to be as careful. You just have to select it. We can go ahead and load those up. So I can kind of go through and figure out which one of these angles I want to take care of. Here, I'm going to do some more broad strokes here on the blues. I want to go ahead and clean up those blues a little bit. Back here, some of that magenta. Here too. Really kind of go in there and seek out those areas that need that contrast. So this is really time consuming, and probably is one of the most time consuming parts of this process. So once you get everything looking fairly finished, then it's just about going in there and finding these little things. So this is a point at the file where if I was working on this for my portfolio and not doing a live demonstration, I may actually shut it down for a little while. I might go for coffee and then come back, because things that I may miss now, if I open it with a fresh pair of eyes, I'll start to notice these other things that are happening. But even that, just cleaning up a few of those things, a few of those angles, helps quite a bit. And I can even roll this back a little bit just in case I think I took too much, up to about 80%. So this is already looking so much better than the other one, but I feel it needs a little bit more contrast. So I'm going to do that here in the channels since I already have a highlights. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and recreate it based on everything we have now. Remember, channels always has to do with what is active. So let's create a adjusted, we'll call this adjusted highlights. And I'll go ahead and, instead of duplicating this while my selection is loaded, I'll invert selection, Command-Shift-I, and create a new layer, and I'll call this Adjusted Shadows. Now, this is going to look a little bit different. Here's the highlights and adjusted highlights. You can see we have this kind of going for us. The reason I did that, I actually want to go ahead and create a mid-tone mask, and I did that by selecting and deselecting these, so we have the mid-tones here. Now, it's pretty cool. Alpha 1, we'll just call it midtones. We'll load that as a selection. We'll say OK, go back to the layers. And I'm just going to do one, I think, so I'm just going to use the curves here. And that's going to be midtones. Midtone boost. So here with the midtone selected, let's just go ahead and pull that up a little bit. Yeah, that looks really nice. Pull the highlights down just a hair. And the last thing I'm going to do here, I'm just going to add a brightness and contrast layer right over top and add a little bit more contrast to this scene, just about 10%, basic contrast. And then the next step is to actually take one of these layers, go in and do filter, other, high pass. Now obviously we've done this quite a bit together, so I'm going to go ahead and do it very quickly and change this to overlay this time, and I'm going to put it above all of our layers here. Perfect. And I just want to zoom in and show you that effect. Now it's crazy sharpening. So I may want to, let's turn that off, turn that on. Okay, good. Let's turn that down to about 80%. And what I'm going to do is just sort of show you my thought process for sharpening a town like this is probably only going to be this central area. So here, I'm just basically going to sharpen basically from here to about here and nothing else, because that's where I want the attention to fall. Everything else I feel is details that aren't quite as important. So if we take a look at this, you can see just the center of that town and nothing else. And if I want to, a tiny little bit of the mountain just to chisel out those details. The next thing I need to do, obviously, is follow up with noise reduction for the sky, but right now it still looks nice and soft, so we'll just go ahead and call this High Pass 2.5. As always, let's take a look at the before and after. I'm going to go ahead and expand everything. This time, though, instead of using the base exposure, I actually want to use the middle exposure because we met in the middle. So let's go ahead and leave that there on the bottom. I'm going to delete the mask. We're going to call this original middle exposure. And what we have is our before with no corrections and our after. So that is a pretty dramatic difference. That's actually what I had envisioned, better than what I had envisioned, because there was a festival going on. I don't know how often they light up the top of the mountain, but I got that really cool green light up there. The town was really beautiful. Believe it or not, everybody actually recognized me in the town as well. So it just goes to show you, if there's something that you really want, it's worth going again, it's worth waiting for, and it's definitely worth a revisit if you want to build it into that portfolio piece. So that wraps up Pietrapertosa, everybody. Next time I see you, we'll be driving around trying to find some other beautiful vantage points in these little Dolomites.